Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on November 9th, 2023. And this week we're talking about the topic of Ecumenism. This is the movement that promotes unity among various religious groups, despite differences they have with one another regarding their doctrines and practices. Now, in a recent episode, Kristofer Gardana joined me to talk about the temptation for churches to welcome anyone and everyone who comes to them. This is related to that, but often this has more to do with churches joining together with other churches and cooperating in various activities, ministries, events, and things like that. Well, is that something that local churches should be doing? We're going to consider that in our episode today. For links to some related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/110923. Now for our discussion this week. The topic for today is the problem with ecumenism. Now, I realize that by stating the title that way, it tips my hand as far as how I'm going to approach this or answer this question. But should churches join themselves with other churches in some sort of ecumenical work? Many people see these efforts as being unquestionably good because, after all, they're uniting together, they're engaging in some good works, they're not letting their differences divide them, and we might ask the question, isn't unity a good thing? And the answer, of course, is yes, unity is a good thing. We need to be working toward unity. However, the unity of ecumenism is not the same type of unity that is described in the scriptures. We'll talk about that more later on in the episode, but there are a couple of questions that we need to consider first. And the first question is this: why is there such a push for ecumenism right now? Those who advocate for this claim that it is what the Lord desires. They often cite Jesus' prayer before he was crucified, when he prayed to the Father in John chapter 17 and said, "I do not ask on behalf of these alone, but for those also who believe in me through their word, that they may be one, even as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may be in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me." Those who are behind the push for ecumenism will claim that they are working to make Jesus' prayer a reality. And most likely, the majority of those who push for this are probably sincere. I realize maybe not all of them are, but I will give them the benefit of the doubt that most of them are likely sincere in their calls for this, but they are misguided. But also, as the world becomes more wicked and more hostile toward anything resembling Christianity, ecumenism provides professed Christians with more support and more encouragement from one another. Ecumenism also allows professed Christians to present a stronger front in battles over social issues, whether it's abortion or transgenderism, which is the big battle out in society lately. And there is strength in numbers. That is a biblical principle. The wise man said in Ecclesiastes 4, verses 9 and 10, that two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Many see ecumenism as a legitimate application of that principle. So there are various reasons and why there is a push for this now, that it allows people to come together, to encourage one another, to strengthen one another, and especially as the world becomes more ungodly. But the second question I want us to consider: what does the Bible say about ecumenism? And the answer to that is nothing specifically. Well, why is that? It's important that we understand why that is. Ecumenism is about all these different churches and religious groups coming together and ignoring their differences, ignoring the differences of doctrine and practice that they have. Why is it that it's not specifically mentioned? That idea is not mentioned in the New Testament. It's because in the first century, there were no different denominations. You didn't have the Baptist Church or the Presbyterian Church or the Methodist Church or the Roman Catholic Church. Those did not exist during the time of the apostles. And the New Testament certainly does talk a lot about unity. We cited already John chapter 17, verses 20 through 21. But also in other passages over in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 3. Paul said there, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in you all. And then down in verse 13 he says, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. So unity is emphasized in the New Testament. We are to strive for unity, be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. But also at the same time, the New Testament condemns the concept of denominationalism. Jesus promised in Matthew 16 and verse 18 to build one church. He said, I will build my church, not churches. He said, I will build my church. Ephesians 1, 22 and 23 describe Jesus as being the head of the church, which is his body. A head just has one body. You don't have a body or a head with many bodies. A head has one body. Jesus has one church. And at the end of Acts chapter 2, when Peter preached the gospel on the day of Pentecost, and you had people responding to that message, where those who received his word were baptized, 3,000 were added on the day of Pentecost. Verse 47 says God continually added to their number, added to the church, day by day, those who were being saved. He wasn't adding them to all these different churches. He was adding them to his church. So the Bible is for unity, but it's against the concept of denominationalism and the division that exists there. So the question then, because of that, is would ecumenism be the answer for this? But we need to understand what the New Testament teaches about unity, because there is a difference between what the Bible teaches about unity and what ecumenism is. So we're going to notice the contrast between these two ideas, and we're going to be using a chart to visualize this. So if you're listening to this on the podcast and not watching the video, the chart will be included in the show notes. But if you're watching the video, then this will be up on the screen so you can get the whole picture of this. But we're going to notice the difference between biblical unity and ecumenism. What are the differences between them? Well, number one, biblical unity has to be based upon the word that was taught by the apostles. Remember the passage that we noticed in John chapter 17, verses 20 and 21. When Jesus prayed to the Father, he said he wanted them to have unity that was based upon the words that they taught. He said in verse 20, I do not ask on behalf of these alone, but for those also who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, even as you, Father, are in me and I in you. The unity that is described in the scriptures is based upon the words that the apostles taught. Ecumenism requires us to ignore certain New Testament passages, whatever ones we disagree on would cause division. We have to ignore those in order to keep that unity. It's not the same unity. Unity that Jesus prayed for is unity that is based upon his words. And the message that the apostles were given when Jesus gave the Great Commission, that was for the whole world. Mark 16:15, he told them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. And in Matthew's account of the Great Commission, he added that when they made disciples, they were to teach them to observe all that he commanded. Well, ecumenism will have different standards for different people. You won't have the same message that's gone out throughout the whole world because they have different standards, they have different practices, they have different doctrines. And it's not the same message. Biblical unity has the same thing being taught in every church. When Paul wrote to the brethren in Corinth, he talked about sending Timothy to them in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 17. And he said that he would remind you of my ways which are in Christ, just as I teach everywhere in every church. The same message was taught in every church. It was the same message for all of them. Earlier in that letter to the Corinthians, he said that they were to be of the same mind in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. But ecumenism accepts that every church is just going to teach different things, and that's perfectly acceptable. That is okay. And Paul said, no, I'm going to teach the same thing everywhere in every church. And if people are teaching different things, that's a problem. You need to correct that. You all need to teach the same thing and be of the same mind. When you have biblical unity, brethren are going to hold fast to the standard that was taught by the apostles, to hold fast the pattern, as 2 Timothy 1 and verse 13 says. And they were going to do this from generation to generation. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, Paul said that I taught you, Timothy, and Timothy, you are going to teach others. They are going to teach others as well. And that same message was going to go on from generation to generation. But with ecumenism and that concept, you have a tolerance for new doctrines and whatever people want to promote, because we still want to be united. We still want to be together. So we have to tolerate that. And with biblical unity, you have brethren from generation to generation holding fast the pattern that is found in the Scriptures. And regarding that pattern, John said that those who went beyond that standard lost their fellowship with God and lost fellowship with those who are faithful to God. 2 John verses 9 through 11 says, anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in his teaching, he has both the Father and the Son, meaning he has fellowship with the Father and Son. The one who goes beyond does not have God, does not have fellowship with him. In verse 10 it says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, and do not give him a greeting, for the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. But with ecumenism, you have people seeking to maintain fellowship with those who don't remain in the doctrine of Christ. They go beyond that, but we still want to join with them. We still want to work with them. And so we ignore what John says here about fellowship and how we are to abide in the doctrine of Christ and not welcome those or have fellowship with those who refuse to do that, who go beyond the doctrine of Christ. And those who taught a message that was contrary to what was taught in the Scriptures, they were to be marked and avoided, as Romans 16 verse 17 says. But with ecumenism, you welcome those who teach a different doctrine because we want to continue to work with them. We want to join in these efforts with them. And the Scriptures teach that those who would not follow what was taught by the apostles, the apostolic traditions and teachings, they were to be avoided as well. It's mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 6. That you keep away from those ones who lead an unruly life and not according to the traditions, to the teachings that were handed down by the apostles. But ecumenism says that you extend fellowship to those who reject apostolic tradition and teaching. They may follow something else, but you accept them anyway. So in summary, ecumenism is not the unity that is described in the New Testament. Instead, it is the type of union that the apostles warned against. Rather than accepting anyone and everyone, regardless of their differences, we need to be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, which is based upon the fact that there is one body, meaning one church, there is one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one body of doctrine that we are to follow, that pattern that we follow, one baptism as we are baptized into Christ, and one God and Father of all. That is the basis for our unity. Ecumenism throws all of that out and says, no, we're going to be united on some other standard because we simply want to do these things together and we're going to ignore what the Scriptures teach. We cannot have that type of unity. We need to have unity of the Spirit. That's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I hope you found this to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to some related materials, visit the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/110923. I mentioned the chart that was used in this episode. That will be in the show notes. Also, this episode is largely based upon an article that I wrote several months back on the Plain Bible Teaching website by the same title, The Problem with Ecumenism. So if you want to see the article, that is also in the show notes. And if you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or share it with others that might be interested, that's always appreciated. And if you're listening to this, remember that we also upload video versions of the podcast to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So if you prefer video, then that option is there for you. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like this video, subscribe to the channel so you can see other videos that we post here from time to time. And if you see a news story or have some topic that you think would make for a good discussion here, send that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.